You're telling me something I've heard 1,000 times, that these are your final years, that the good part is behind you, that what's left is smaller, quieter, slower, and that you should be grateful for whatever remains. I don't believe that. And I don't think you believe it either. Not completely. Because if you did, you wouldn't be here listening to an old man talk about what's still possible. Something in you is still looking. Something in you has not given up. I want to talk about that something today. And I need you to sit with me for a while before you decide whether you agree or disagree. This is not a lecture. This is one old man telling you what 80 years of living and 40 of those in silence taught him about what it means to finally arrive at a life worth having. I am not here to tell you that everything happens for a reason. I am not here to tell you that your best years are still ahead if you just think the right thoughts. I am here to talk about something much simpler and much harder than that. I am here to talk about the difference between a man or woman who is waiting to live and one who has finally decided to begin. Those are two very different people, and only one of them will look back without regret. I have watched people reach their 60s and 70s and believe, quietly, secretly, that if they just wait a little longer, life will finally arrange itself into something worth inhabiting. They are waiting for the children to visit more often. They are waiting for the old argument to resolve itself. They are waiting for the pain in their knees to ease, for the right season, for some unnamed permission that never comes. And every time I saw this, I thought, person is not old. This person has been waiting their entire life. The years just made the waiting more visible. Here is what waiting costs you, not later, now. It costs you the morning that passed while you planned what you would do when things were better. It costs you the conversation you didn't start because the time wasn't quite right. It costs you the walk you didn't take, the letter you didn't write, the hand you didn't reach for because something in you said, not yet. And waiting, I have come to understand, is not patience. Patience is what you practice when you are fully present and something outside you requires time. Waiting is what you do when you are absent from your own life, standing just outside the door of it, hoping someone will eventually invite you in. No one is coming to that door. You are already inside. The question is whether you will stop standing in the hallway. I have watched men, good men, serious men, men who worked hard and meant well, spend the first years of their retirement looking around in quiet bewilderment, as if someone had promised them that rest would feel like reward. And it did not feel like reward. It felt like silence where purpose used to be. It felt like a room they didn't know how to furnish. They had spent 40 years building a life organized around obligation. And when the obligation ended, they discovered that they had never learned what they actually wanted. They had been so busy becoming what others needed that they had never finished becoming themselves. That is not a small thing to discover at 68. But it is not too late either. The first truth I want to give you is this. The years ahead of you are not a diminished version of the years behind you. They are a different kind of year entirely. The man who understands this does not spend his mornings grieving what his body can no longer do. He asks with genuine curiosity what this particular morning, this one, with these hands, in this light, is asking of him. That shift sounds small. It is not small. It is the difference between a life that is winding down and a life that is finally awake. I knew a man named Walter. He was 68 when I met him, retired, healthy enough, living alone after his wife had passed some years before. He had 2 grown children, a son in another state, and a daughter who called on holidays. Walter was not unhappy in any dramatic way. He had food, he had a house, he had enough. But I watched him across many months, and what I saw was a man who had organized his entire inner life around waiting. He was waiting for his son to call without being prompted. He was waiting for his daughter to suggest a visit. He was waiting for someone to recognize, without being told, that he was lonely. And because he was a proud man, a man who had spent 60 years not asking for what he needed, the waiting was invisible even to him. He had dressed it up as patience. He had called it not wanting to be a burden. One evening, he told me that he hadn't spoken to his son in 11 weeks. Not because anything had happened between them, only because neither of them had picked up the phone. And Walter said, with a kind of tired dignity, that he supposed his son was busy. I asked him one question. I said, "Walter, if your son called you right now, what would you actually want to say to him?" He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I'd want to tell him I'm proud of him." I've never really said that, not plainly, not the way I mean it. I said, "Then call him, tonight. Say exactly that." Walter looked at me as if I had suggested something dangerous, and in a way I had, because saying the true thing plainly after a lifetime of leaving it unsaid is a kind of danger. It requires you to admit that you have been waiting when you could have been living. It requires a courage that has nothing to do with strength and everything to do with willingness. He called his son that night. I don't know everything that was said, but I know that 3 weeks later, his son drove 6 hours to spend a weekend with him. Not because Walter finally asked, because Walter finally spoke. The last years are not made better by waiting for others to arrive. They are made better by the willingness to cross the distance yourself, even when you did not create it, even when crossing it costs you something. That is not weakness. That is the only kind of strength that matters at the end. Before I go further, one thing, I won't be here forever, and most of what I know was never written anywhere, so I wrote it down, the Zen way. 20 teachings, 4 parts, in the order they were meant to be received. The link is in the description. But stay here, because what I'm about to share next is the part most people never hear. Now, I want to talk about pain, not as a problem, as a place. Most people I have known who were unhappy in their later years were not unhappy because life had treated them badly. They were unhappy because they had decided somewhere along the way that their pain was evidence that something had gone wrong, that suffering meant failure, that a good life should have arrived by now at a kind of peace that does not hurt. I am not against that hope, but I want to tell you what my teacher told me in the last winter of his life, when I sat beside him and asked how he bore it, the cold, the illness, the weight of so many years. He said, "I stopped asking the fire to stop burning. I asked instead what I was being asked to burn away." That is not a comfortable answer. It was not meant to be. In the tradition I carry, suffering is not the opposite of a good life. It is the ground of one. The stone at the bottom of the river does not move because the current is gentle. It becomes smooth because the current is not. Every year that scraped you, every loss that carved into you, every morning you got up when you had no reason to, those are not wounds that disqualify you from a good life. They are the preparation for one. If you are still here, they did not break you. They shaped you. And the question is whether you will use the shape. I am not against rest. A man who has worked hard deserves rest, but there is a rest that restores, and there is a rest that numbs. And I have watched too many people confuse the second for the first. They stopped moving because moving hurt. They stopped reaching because reaching had sometimes failed. They closed themselves down, slowly and reasonably, one small withdrawal at a time, and called it wisdom. And then one day they looked up and realized they were living inside a life that had become very small and very quiet and very safe and almost entirely empty. Safety is not the same as peace. I need you to hear that. A life organized around the avoidance of pain is not a peaceful life. It is a careful one, and careful is not the same as alive. The master I spent 20 years with was a man who had lost everything by the time he was 40, his family, his country, the first monastery he had built with his own hands. He arrived with nothing but the practice, and he rebuilt from there. By the time I knew him, he was not a man haunted by loss. He was a man illuminated by it. And when I asked him once what had made the difference, he told me this. He said, "I stopped treating my grief as a wall. I treated it as a door I walked through. What was on the other side was not happiness. It was my own life, waiting. That is what I am asking of you now. Not happiness. Not the absence of grief, your own life. Whatever is still on the other side of the door you have been standing in front of. I want to tell you about a woman named Doris. She was 71 when her husband died. They had been married 44 years, and she had organized her entire daily life around another person, not out of weakness, but out of love. He had been the one who suggested the walks. He had been the one who noticed when the garden needed tending. He had been the reason she got up at a particular hour, ate at a particular time, moved through the world in a particular rhythm. When he died, the rhythm stopped. And Doris found herself standing in a life that had the right furniture and the right address, and none of the meaning. She told me later that for 2 years she did very little. She kept the house clean. She answered phone calls. She attended the things she was supposed to attend. But she felt, she said, like a woman watching her own life from a very slight distance, present enough to perform it, not present enough to inhabit it. Then, one morning in early March, without planning to, she went out to the back garden and planted a bulb. Not because she felt hope, not because someone suggested it. She planted it because her hands remembered doing it, and that morning her hands needed something to do. She told me she stood there afterward looking at the turned earth, and she thought, I just did something for a spring I will actually see. Not for him, for a spring that will come whether or not I am ready for it. That was the door. She did not transform overnight. There was no sudden restoration of joy. But that morning something shifted in her, a small, quiet decision that the future was a place she still belonged in. That tending something, making something, showing up for a season that had not yet arrived, was not foolishness. It was the most honest thing she had done in 2 years. By the following autumn, Doris had started a small reading group in her neighborhood. 4 people, then 7, then 12. She told me that most of them came for the books, but stayed for the conversation. She told me that for the first time since her husband died, she felt that she was not just existing inside a week, but building one. She still missed him every day. That did not change. But she had stopped waiting for the missing to end before she allowed herself to live. She had planted something, and it grew. I want to speak now to the people who are listening and thinking, this sounds well and good, but you don't know what I've been through. You don't know what I've lost. You don't know how tired I am. You are right. I don't know your particular story. I don't know the specific shape of your loss or the particular weight of your years. But I want to say something to you anyway, and I want you to hear it without flinching. You have survived everything that has happened to you so far. Every betrayal, every ending. Every morning you woke up to a life that looked nothing like what you had planned. You are still here. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, extraordinary. Most people do not recognize their own endurance because endurance does not feel like strength while you are inside it. It only feels like continuing. But continuing, when continuing is hard, is not ordinary. It is rare. And you have been doing it for a very long time. What I am asking you to do now is not to feel better, not to forgive the past if you are not ready, not to pretend the losses were not real or the years were not hard. I am only asking you to take one thing seriously. One thing. The time that remains is real. It is not a footnote. It is not the tail end of the story. It is still the story. And you are still the one writing it. You did not come this far to sit down at the edge of the field and watch the season pass. You came this far because something in you knew there was more ground to cover. That something is still there. I can tell because you are still listening. There is a courtyard I remember at the monastery where I spent my earliest years as a student. It was a simple place. Stone walls, a single tree, a small fire that was kept burning through the night. In winter, the cold came through the walls, and the old monks sat with their backs straight and their eyes open, and they did not look like men who were enduring something. They looked like men who had made peace with the terms of their existence. Not happy in the way that word is usually used. Something steadier than that. Something that did not depend on the morning being warm, or the news being good, or the ache in their bodies being absent. I asked the eldest of them once what that feeling was. He thought for a long time. Then he said, "It is the feeling of a man who has stopped fighting the river and learned to swim." That is what I want for you. Not the absence of current, the knowledge that you can move through it. Go outside today. Find something alive, a tree, a bird, a patch of ground that is doing what ground does without asking permission. Look at it for longer than feels necessary. And ask yourself, honestly, what one thing you have been postponing that does not actually require waiting. Not everything. One thing. Begin there. The last years are not behind you. They are in front of you, and they are waiting, not for the right conditions, but for the right decision. Make it today. If what you heard today settled somewhere in you, The Zen Way is in the description. 20 teachings, 4 parts, in the order they were meant to be received. The link is there. So is the QR code if you prefer. Now I want to hear from you. Tell me in the comments, what is one thing you stopped doing after a loss that part of you still wants to return to? I read every comment, and if this is the kind of conversation you have been looking for, subscribe. We are not collecting viewers here. We are collecting people who are still willing to begin. Come back next week. I am not done teaching.